August 12th, 30 BC, Alexandria, Egypt. In a locked chamber of the royal palace, Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, lay dying. She was 39 years old. For 22 years she had ruled Egypt with intelligence, cunning, and unprecedented power. She had seduced two of Rome's most powerful men, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. She had commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and fought to preserve Egypt's independence against the growing might of Rome. But now it was over. Her lover, Mark Antony, was already dead, fallen on his own sword after a devastating defeat in battle. Her children were prisoners. Her capital city was occupied by Roman soldiers, and Octavian, the new master of Rome, was coming to parade her through the streets of Rome in chains, a living trophy of his conquest. Cleopatra would not allow it. She had spent her entire life fighting for power, for Egypt, for her dynasty. She would not end her days as a prisoner in Rome, humiliated before jeering crowds. So she chose her own death. The ancient sources disagree on exactly how she died. Some say she used an asp, a venomous snake smuggled into her chamber in a basket of figs. Others claim she used a poison hairpin or a toxic ointment. But the result was the same. When Roman soldiers broke down the door, they found Cleopatra dead on her golden couch, dressed in her royal robes, her crown on her head. Two of her handmaidens lay dead beside her. She had died as she had lived, on her own terms, a queen to the very end. With Cleopatra's death, the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek royal family that had ruled Egypt for 300 years, came to an end. Egypt, the oldest and wealthiest kingdom in the world, became a Roman province. The age of the pharaohs was over. This is the story of Cleopatra and the Ptolemaic bloodline. A dynasty founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals, a family that blended Greek and Egyptian culture, that built the Library of Alexandria and ruled from the most magnificent city in the ancient world. It is a story of power, ambition, incest, murder, and betrayal. A dynasty that married brothers to sisters for generations, that assassinated rivals without mercy, and that ultimately destroyed itself from within. This is the story of Egypt's last pharaoh dynasty, and the woman who became its final, most legendary ruler. To understand Cleopatra, you must first understand how her family came to rule Egypt. The story begins with Alexander the Great. In 333 BC, Alexander of Macedon, just 23 years old, invaded the Persian Empire, the largest empire in the world. Over the next decade, he conquered everything from Greece to India. He was never defeated in battle. He founded over 20 cities, all named Alexandria. He became a living legend. But in 323 BC, at just 32 years old, Alexander died suddenly in Babylon, possibly from disease, possibly from poison. He left behind the largest empire the world had ever seen, and no clear heir. His wife Roxana was pregnant, but the child was not yet born. Alexander's half-brother Philip was mentally disabled and could not rule. His generals looked at each other and realized the empire was up for grabs. What followed was a brutal power struggle that lasted for decades. Alexander's empire was torn apart by his former commanders, men who had fought beside him from Greece to India, and now turned their swords on each other. They called themselves the Diadochi, the successors, and they fought a series of wars so vicious that entire cities were destroyed, populations massacred, and Alexander's family wiped out. Roxana and her son were murdered. Philip was executed. Even Alexander's mother was killed. One of Alexander's most trusted commanders was Ptolemy, son of Lagus. Ptolemy was smart, cautious, and ruthless. While other generals fought over Macedonia and Asia, Ptolemy moved quickly to seize Egypt. Egypt was the richest prize in the ancient world. It had wealth beyond imagination: grain, gold, papyrus, trade routes. The Nile flooded every year, making the land the most fertile in the Mediterranean. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled the economy of the known world. Ptolemy marched into Egypt in 323 BC and declared himself satrap, governor, but he had bigger ambitions. Within a few years he declared himself Pharaoh. Ptolemy I Soter, which means savior. He founded a new dynasty, the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek family ruling an Egyptian kingdom. Ptolemy was brilliant. He understood that to rule Egypt, he had to become Egyptian. So he adopted Egyptian customs, built Egyptian temples, and declared himself the heir to the pharaohs of old, the successor to Ramses, to Tutankhamun, to all the ancient kings who had ruled for 3,000 years. He even stole Alexander the Great's corpse. When Alexander's funeral procession was travelling from Babylon to Macedonia, Ptolemy hijacked it, brought the body to Egypt, and displayed it in a golden sarcophagus in Alexandria. By possessing Alexander's body, Ptolemy claimed to be Alexander's true successor. Ptolemy also founded the city's greatest achievement, the Library of Alexandria. It was the largest library in the ancient world, housing hundreds of thousands of scrolls, perhaps as many as 500,000. It contained the works of Homer, Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and countless others. Scholars came from across the Mediterranean to study there. It was the centre of knowledge, science, and philosophy. The Ptolemies also built the Pharos lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It stood over 400 feet tall and guided ships into Alexandria's harbour with a fire that could be seen for miles. Under the Ptolemy and his successors, Alexandria became the most important city in the world, richer than Athens, more magnificent than Rome. It was a city of marble palaces, towering lighthouses, and bustling harbours filled with ships from every nation. But there was a problem. The Ptolemies were Greek. They spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and followed Greek customs. Most of them never even bothered to learn Egyptian. To the native Egyptians, the Ptolemies were foreign conquerors, but the Ptolemies didn't care. As long as the grain flowed, the taxes were collected, and the people stayed obedient, they were content. For the first century of Ptolemaic rule, the dynasty thrived. But then came the rot. The Ptolemies had one major problem. They couldn't stop killing each other. Like the pharaohs before them, the Ptolemies practiced incest. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces. It was done to keep power within the family, to avoid splitting the kingdom among rival claimants. But it also created a family culture of paranoia, betrayal, and murder. Ptolemy II married his full sister, Arsinoe II. She was co-ruler and was worshipped as a goddess alongside him. Their marriage set the precedent. From then on, nearly every Ptolemaic ruler married a close relative. Over the generations, the gene pool shrank. The royal family became increasingly inbred. But unlike the Habsburgs centuries later, the Ptolemies seemed to avoid the worst genetic consequences, at least physically. What they couldn't avoid was the violence. Brothers murdered brothers, mothers poisoned sons, sisters betrayed sisters, husbands killed wives. Ptolemy IV murdered his mother, his uncle, and his brother to secure his throne. He was a weak and dissolute ruler who spent his time drinking and attending orgies while Egypt fell into chaos. But the worst was Ptolemy VIII, known as Physcon, which means fatty. He was a grotesque figure, obese and cruel. He married his sister Cleopatra II. Then, when her daughter, his niece, came of age, he divorced his sister and married the niece instead. His ex-wife revolted. A civil war erupted. And in the midst of the fighting, Ptolemy VIII did something unthinkable. He had a son, a teenager named Memphis, from his first marriage. The boy was living in Cyprus. Ptolemy VIII ordered the boy brought to him. Then, in a fit of rage, he murdered his own son, dismembered the body, and sent the pieces to the boy's mother, his ex-wife, on her birthday. She opened the box. Inside were her son's head, hands, and feet. This was the kind of family Cleopatra was born into. A dynasty that had normalized fratricide, regicide, and every kind of betrayal. By the time we reached the 1st century BC, the Ptolemaic dynasty had become infamous for its cruelty and dysfunction. Rival family members fought civil wars. Mobs rioted in the streets of Alexandria. Egypt, once the wealthiest kingdom in the world, was falling apart. And Rome was watching. Rome had grown into a superpower. It had conquered Carthage, Greece, and much of the Mediterranean. Now it was eyeing Egypt, the richest prize of all. The Ptolemies knew they couldn't defeat Rome militarily, so they tried diplomacy. They paid bribes, they offered trade deals, they tried to become Rome's ally instead of its enemy. Into this desperate, violent, crumbling dynasty, in 69 BC, Cleopatra VII was born. Cleopatra was not her birth name. She was born Cleopatra VII Philopater, Cleopatra VII, beloved of her father. The name Cleopatra was common in the Ptolemaic family. There had been 6 Cleopatras before her, but when we say Cleopatra today, we mean only her, the last and greatest of the line. Cleopatra was the daughter of Ptolemy XII, a weak and unpopular king who spent most of his reign trying to stay in power. He was hated by the Egyptian people, mocked by the Greeks, and constantly threatened by Rome. Ptolemy XII was so desperate for Roman protection that he paid enormous bribes to Julius Caesar and other Roman politicians. He borrowed vast sums of money from Roman lenders, plunging Egypt into debt. He even fled to Rome at one point when his own people revolted against him. Cleopatra grew up watching her father's humiliation. She saw how weak Egypt had become. She understood that her family's survival depended on Rome, but she also understood something her father didn't. Charm and intelligence could be just as powerful as money. Cleopatra grew up in the royal palace in Alexandria, one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world. She was highly educated, tutored in philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and languages. Ancient sources claim she spoke 9 languages fluently: Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Ethiopian, Troglodyte, Syrian, Median, and Parthian. This was extraordinary. Most Ptolemaic rulers never bothered to learn Egyptian. They ruled Egypt for 300 years and never spoke to their own people. But Cleopatra did. She was the first Ptolemaic pharaoh in 300 years who could actually speak to the native Egyptians in their own language. She also studied Egyptian religion and culture. She learned the rituals, the prayers, the ancient texts. She styled herself as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis, the most powerful goddess in Egyptian mythology. This was brilliant. By presenting herself as Isis, Cleopatra connected with the Egyptian people in a way no Ptolemy ever had. She was no longer just a Greek conqueror. She was a living goddess, the rightful queen of Egypt. She was also politically brilliant from a young age. She watched her father struggle to maintain power, watched Rome grow stronger, watched Egypt grow weaker. She understood the game, and she knew that when her father died, she would need to play it perfectly, or Egypt would be swallowed by Rome. When her father died in 51 BC, Cleopatra was just 18 years old. According to tradition, she was supposed to co-rule Egypt with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. And according to Ptolemaic custom, she was supposed to marry him. She did. But she had no intention of sharing power. From the moment she became queen, Cleopatra made it clear she was in charge. She issued coins with only her face on them, ignoring her brother entirely. She made decisions without consulting him. She appeared in public dressed as the goddess Isis, proclaiming herself the reincarnation of the divine. Ancient documents from her reign show that she signed decrees alone, without her brother's name. This was unprecedented. In every previous co-regency, both rulers' names appeared together. Cleopatra was declaring to the world, "I am the pharaoh, not him." Her brother's advisors were furious. They saw Cleopatra as a threat, too ambitious, too clever, too dangerous. Chief among them was Pothinus, the royal eunuch who effectively controlled the young king. Pothinus and his allies began plotting against Cleopatra. They whispered to the court that she was arrogant, that she ignored tradition, that she was dangerous to Egypt. In 48 BC, when Cleopatra was 21, her brother's advisors launched a coup. They drove Cleopatra out of Alexandria and took control of the government. Ptolemy XIII, still just 13 years old, was now the sole ruler, though in reality his advisors controlled him completely. Cleopatra fled to Syria and began raising an army. She gathered mercenaries, called on allies, and prepared to invade Egypt and take back her throne. She was not going to let her little brother steal what was hers. But before she could launch her invasion, something happened that would change her life forever. Julius Caesar arrived. Julius Caesar was the most powerful man in Rome. He had just defeated his rival, Pompey the Great, in a brutal civil war that had torn the Roman Republic apart. Pompey had fled to Egypt, hoping for sanctuary from the Ptolemaic court. But when Pompey arrived in Alexandria, Ptolemy's advisors made a calculated decision. They wanted to win Caesar's favour, so they murdered Pompey, cut off his head, and presented it to Caesar as a gift when he arrived. Caesar landed in Alexandria, expecting to find his rival. Instead, he was handed Pompey's severed head. Caesar was horrified. Pompey had been his enemy, yes, but he was also a Roman consul, a man of honour, a fellow Roman. To murder him like a common criminal was an insult to Rome itself. Caesar wept. Whether from genuine grief or political theatre, we don't know. But the message was clear. The Egyptians had miscalculated. Caesar occupied Alexandria with his legions and demanded that Egypt pay its enormous debts to Rome, debts Ptolemy XII had accumulated. He also summoned both Cleopatra and Ptolemy to appear before him and settle their dispute. Cleopatra saw her chance. She was camped outside Alexandria with her army, but she couldn't simply march into the city. Her brother's soldiers controlled the gates, and they would arrest or kill her on sight. So she devised a plan that would become one of the most famous moments in history. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into the palace at night, rolled up inside a carpet or a linen sack. Her loyal servant, Apollodoros the Sicilian, carried the bundle through the palace gates and into Caesar's private chambers. When Apollodoros unrolled the carpet in front of Caesar, out stepped Cleopatra, young, beautiful, and utterly fearless. It was one of history's most dramatic entrances. Caesar was 52 years old, a hardened general who had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and fought civil wars. He had seen everything, but Cleopatra captivated him. She was intelligent, charming, and spoke fluent Latin, something no other Ptolemaic ruler had ever bothered to learn. She debated philosophy with him, discussed military strategy, flattered his ego, and made it clear she wanted his support against her brother. That night, according to ancient sources, Cleopatra became Caesar's lover. Within days, Caesar declared that Cleopatra and her brother should rule Egypt together, as tradition demanded. But everyone knew the truth. Cleopatra had won. She had Caesar's favour, and that meant everything. Her brother's advisors were furious. They had murdered Pompey to win Caesar's favour, but Caesar had chosen Cleopatra instead. They launched a rebellion, besieging Caesar and Cleopatra inside the royal palace. What followed was the siege of Alexandria, a brutal street battle that lasted for months. Caesar's small force of legionaries was trapped in the palace district, surrounded by tens of thousands of Egyptian soldiers and angry mobs. Ships were set on fire in the harbour, buildings burned. In the chaos, the great library of Alexandria caught fire. The exact details are debated by historians. Some say Caesar deliberately set fire to Egyptian ships, and the flames spread to the library. Others claim it was accidental. Either way, thousands of irreplaceable scrolls were destroyed, one of history's greatest cultural catastrophes. The knowledge of centuries, the works of countless philosophers, scientists, and poets, gone in a single night. But Caesar and Cleopatra survived. Caesar fought brilliantly, holding out against overwhelming odds. When Roman reinforcements finally arrived from Syria, they crushed the rebellion. Ptolemy XIII fled the palace and drowned in the Nile while trying to escape, weighed down by his golden armour. Cleopatra was now sole ruler of Egypt, and Caesar had made it happen. Cleopatra wasted no time consolidating power. She married her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. He was only 12 years old, and made him co-ruler in name only. In reality, Cleopatra ruled Egypt alone. She also gave birth to a son. She named him Caesarion, Little Caesar. She claimed Julius Caesar was the father. Caesar never officially acknowledged the boy, but he didn't deny it either. Roman law didn't allow Caesar to marry a foreigner, so Cleopatra could never be his legal wife. But the message was clear. Cleopatra had produced an heir, a son with the blood of both Egypt and Rome. In 46 BC, Caesar invited Cleopatra to Rome. She arrived in spectacular fashion, bringing Caesarion, her brother husband to Ptolemy, her entourage, and a display of Egyptian wealth that stunned the Romans. She stayed in one of Caesar's villas across the Tiber River, She hosted lavish banquets where Roman senators reclined on Egyptian couches and ate delicacies they had never tasted before. She appeared in public as the Queen of Egypt, dressed in gold and jewels, carried on a litter like a goddess. The Romans were fascinated and horrified. A foreign queen, living openly as Caesar's mistress, flaunting her power in the heart of the Republic. Caesar commissioned a golden statue of Cleopatra and placed it in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the temple dedicated to Venus, the goddess from whom Caesar claimed descent. It was an honor usually reserved for gods and Roman heroes. The Senate was outraged, but Caesar didn't care. He was the most powerful man in Rome, and he was planning something even more audacious. Rumors spread that Caesar wanted to make himself king, that he wanted to move the capital of Rome to Alexandria, that he wanted to marry Cleopatra and make her his queen. Roman senators were terrified. They had fought for centuries to abolish the monarchy. They would not allow a king to rule Rome again, especially not a king with a foreign queen at his side. On March 15th, 44 BC, the Ides of March, a group of senators led by Brutus and Cassius cornered Julius Caesar in the theatre of Pompey. They stabbed him 23 times. Caesar died at the foot of Pompey's statue, bleeding out on the marble floor. Cleopatra's world collapsed. Without Caesar, she had no protection. Rome was descending into civil war again. Angry mobs were hunting down Caesar's supporters. Rumors spread that Cleopatra would be arrested or assassinated. She fled back to Egypt with Caesarion, sailing across the Mediterranean in terror. Shortly after her return, her brother husband Ptolemy XIV died suddenly. The official cause was illness, but most historians believe Cleopatra had him poisoned. She was now the sole ruler of Egypt, and her son Caesarion was her co-ruler, Ptolemy XV Caesar, Pharaoh of Egypt. But Cleopatra's story was far from over. After Caesar's assassination, Rome exploded into chaos. Two men emerged as the leading contenders for power: Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir and great-nephew, and Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general and closest friend. At first, Octavian and Antony worked together. They formed the Second Triumvirate with Lepidus and hunted down Caesar's assassins. They defeated Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. Then they divided the Roman world between them. Octavian took the west, Italy, Gaul, Spain. Antony took the east, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and the east meant Egypt. In 41 BC, Mark Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus, a city in modern-day Turkey. He wanted Egypt's wealth to fund his military campaigns against the Parthian Empire. He expected Cleopatra to come begging for his protection like her father had done with Roman politicians. She did the opposite. Cleopatra arrived in Tarsus on a golden barge with purple sails perfumed with incense. The oars were silver, the sails billowed in the breeze, and musicians played flutes and lyres. She reclined under a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as the goddess Venus, fanned by boys dressed as cupids. Plutarch writes that the people of Tarsus abandoned Antony's tribunal and rushed to the riverbank to watch her arrive. They said it was as if Venus herself had come to feast with Bacchus for the good of Asia. It was pure theatre, and it worked. Mark Antony was a larger-than-life figure, a brilliant general, a legendary drinker, a man who loved spectacle and excess. Ancient sources describe him as completely mesmerized by Cleopatra. Like Caesar before him, he fell for Cleopatra, not just for her beauty, but for her intelligence, her wit, her power. They began an affair that would become one of history's most famous love stories, and one of its greatest tragedies. Antony and Cleopatra spent the winter of 41 to 40 BC together in Alexandria. They formed a society called the Inimitable Livers, a club dedicated to extravagant feasts, philosophical debates, and wild parties. They hunted together, gambled together, drank together. Cleopatra even disguised herself and wandered the streets of Alexandria with Antony at night, playing pranks on citizens. But this was more than a love affair. It was a political alliance. Cleopatra needed Rome's military power to protect Egypt from threats, both internal and external. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund his campaigns. Together they believed they could dominate the eastern Mediterranean and challenge Octavian's control of the West. In 40 BC, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, Sun and Moon. They were Antony's children, but Antony was already married. His wife was Octavia, Octavian's sister. The marriage had been arranged to seal the alliance between Antony and Octavian after Caesar's death. When Octavian learned that Antony was openly living with Cleopatra and had fathered her children, he was furious. This was a betrayal, not just of Octavia, but of Rome itself. Antony tried to balance both worlds. He returned to Rome, reconciled with Octavia, and tried to mend his relationship with Octavian. For a few years he played the role of loyal Roman husband. But in 37 BC, Antony returned to the east and never went back to Rome. He divorced Octavia and married Cleopatra in an Egyptian ceremony. Rome was scandalized. A Roman general marrying a foreign queen? It was unthinkable. In 34 BC, Antony held a massive ceremony in Alexandria called the Donations of Alexandria. He declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings and Caesarion King of Kings. He gave territories to Cleopatra's children, Cyprus to Cleopatra Selene, Syria to Alexander Helios. He was essentially carving up Rome's Eastern Empire and handing it to Cleopatra's family. Octavian saw his opportunity. He launched a propaganda campaign, painting Antony as a traitor who had abandoned Rome for an Egyptian seductress. He claimed Cleopatra was a witch who had enslaved Antony with magic and potions. He called her the Harlot Queen and said she planned to conquer Rome and make Alexandria the capital of the world. It was brilliant propaganda, and it worked. Roman public opinion turned against Antony. In 32 BC, Octavian declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. It was a clever move. By framing the conflict as Rome versus Egypt, Octavian avoided the appearance of another Roman civil war. But everyone knew the truth. This was a battle for control of the Roman world, and the winner would rule everything. The decisive battle came on September 2nd, 31 BC at Actium, a promontory on the western coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra commanded a fleet of over 200 warships and an army of over 70,000 soldiers. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant Admiral Agrippa, was smaller but faster and more maneuverable. The battle was a disaster for Antony and Cleopatra. Agrippa's ships surrounded and outmaneuvered the heavier Egyptian fleet. Antony's ships were trapped, unable to use their size advantage in the narrow waters. The wind was against them. Their crews were demoralized. In the midst of the battle, Cleopatra made a decision that would haunt history. She ordered her 60 ships to break through the Roman lines and flee back to Egypt. Antony, seeing Cleopatra's purple sails disappearing over the horizon, abandoned his fleet and followed her. He transferred to a smaller, faster ship and chased after her, leaving his entire army and navy behind. It was a catastrophic mistake. Without their commanders, Antony's fleet and army collapsed. Thousands of soldiers surrendered or were killed. Octavian had won. Ancient historians debated why Cleopatra fled. Some said she panicked. Others claimed it was a pre-arranged signal to retreat. Some even accused her of betraying Antony deliberately. The truth is probably simpler. Cleopatra saw the battle was lost and refused to be captured. She fled to save herself, her children, and Egypt's treasure. But in doing so, she destroyed Antony's reputation. Rome saw him as a coward who abandoned his men to chase after a woman. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria and tried to regroup. They sent desperate messages to their allies, begging for support. They tried to negotiate with Octavian, but it was hopeless. One by one, Antony's allies deserted him. His soldiers defected. His generals surrendered. By the summer of 30 BC, Octavian's forces were at the gates of Alexandria. On August 1st, Antony led a desperate cavalry charge against Octavian's army. At first, it seemed like he might succeed. His horsemen broke through the Roman lines. But then his fleet and infantry betrayed him. They surrendered to Octavian without a fight. Antony, betrayed and defeated, returned to the palace in despair. According to legend, someone told Antony that Cleopatra was dead. that she had killed herself in her tomb. Heartbroken, Antony decided to follow her. He ordered his slave Eros to kill him. Eros refused and killed himself instead. So Antony fell on his own sword. But the wound wasn't immediately fatal. He lay bleeding, in agony, when word arrived. Cleopatra was still alive. She had barricaded herself in her mausoleum with her treasure. Antony's men carried him to the tomb. Cleopatra refused to open the doors, afraid Roman soldiers would storm in. So Antony was hoisted up through a window by ropes. Cleopatra held him as he died. Ancient sources say she wept, tore her clothes, and beat her chest in grief. Antony's last words, according to the historian Plutarch, were to comfort her and to tell her not to mourn his misfortunes, but to remember the happiness they had shared. Mark Antony died in Cleopatra's arms. And now she was alone. Cleopatra knew what was coming. Octavian would parade her through Rome in chains as part of his triumph. She would be humiliated before jeering crowds, then strangled in prison, the traditional fate of defeated enemies. She would not allow it. For the next 10 days, Cleopatra negotiated with Octavian. She asked for mercy for her children. She offered him Egypt's treasure, gold, jewels, grain. She even met with him in person, trying one last time to seduce a Roman conqueror, as she had done with Caesar and Antony. But Octavian was not like Caesar or Antony. He was cold, calculating, and immune to her charm. He saw Cleopatra as a dangerous enemy, not a romantic conquest. He told her she would be spared, but she knew he was lying. On August 12, 30 BC, Cleopatra had her servants bring her a basket of figs. Hidden inside was a venomous snake, an asp, the sacred serpent of Egyptian royalty, symbol of the pharaohs. Cleopatra dressed in her finest robes and placed the royal crown on her head. She lay down on her golden couch as if preparing for a divine ceremony. Then she let the snake bite her. When Roman soldiers broke into the chamber, they found Cleopatra dead, lying in regal splendor. Her two most loyal handmaidens, Iris and Charmian, lay dead beside her. One of the soldiers asked Charmian, who was dying, "Was this well done?" With her last breath, Charmian replied, "It is well done, and fitting for a princess descended from so many kings." Cleopatra had died as she had lived, on her own terms, a queen to the very end. Octavian ordered Cleopatra to be buried beside Mark Antony, but he showed no mercy to her children by Caesar. Caesarion, Cleopatra's eldest son, was 17 years old. He was the last male heir of the Ptolemaic dynasty and a potential rival to Octavian. After all, he was Julius Caesar's son, with a claim to Rome itself. Octavian hunted him down. Caesarion was fleeing Egypt, trying to reach safety in India, when he was captured and executed. One of Octavian's advisors famously told him, "Too many Caesars is not a good thing." With Caesarion's death, the male line of the Ptolemaic bloodline was extinct. Cleopatra's other children, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and her youngest son Ptolemy Philadelphus, were spared. They were taken to Rome and raised by Octavian's sister, Octavia, Antony's former wife. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus disappear from historical records. They likely died young, possibly from illness, but Cleopatra Selene survived. She grew up in Rome, educated and cultured. In 25 BC, Octavian, now calling himself Augustus, the first Roman emperor, arranged for her to marry Juba II, the king of Mauritania, a Roman client kingdom in North Africa. Cleopatra Selene became a queen, just like her mother. She ruled Mauritania alongside her husband for decades. She had children, she built monuments, she promoted Greek and Egyptian culture in her new kingdom, preserving her mother's legacy. She named her son Ptolemy, keeping the family name alive for one more generation. When Cleopatra Selene died around 5 BC, the last remnant of Cleopatra's bloodline faded into history. Egypt, the oldest and richest kingdom in the ancient world, was now a Roman province. The pharaohs were gone, the Ptolemies were gone, and Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, was a memory. But what a memory she became. The Romans tried to erase her. Octavian's propaganda painted her as a seductress, a witch, a foreign threat to Rome. Roman poets like Horace wrote verses celebrating her death. Roman historians like Plutarch portrayed her as manipulative and deceitful, but they couldn't erase her legend. Cleopatra became one of the most famous women in history. Over the centuries, playwrights, poets, and artists reimagined her life. Shakespeare wrote a tragedy about her. Hollywood made her into a movie star, played by Elizabeth Taylor in one of the most expensive films ever made. But the real Cleopatra was far more interesting than any myth. She was not just a seductress, she was a brilliant politician, a skilled diplomat, and a military strategist. She spoke 9 languages. She commanded armies. She ruled one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the world for 22 years. She didn't seduce Caesar and Antony with beauty alone. She did it with intelligence, charm, and political acumen. She understood power. She knew how to use it. And she nearly succeeded in preserving Egypt's independence against the might of Rome. In the end, she failed. But she went down fighting. And she chose her own death rather than submit to humiliation. That choice became her most iconic act, an act of defiance that echoed through history. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for 300 years. They built Alexandria into the greatest city of the ancient world. They created the Library of Alexandria, the Pharaoh's lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and monuments that still inspire awe today. But they were also a dynasty defined by incest, murder, and paranoia. Brothers killed brothers, sisters betrayed sisters, mothers poisoned sons. The Ptolemies believed that keeping power in the family would make them stronger. Instead, it made them weaker. Generation after generation, they married their siblings and cousins. They killed anyone who threatened their power, even their own children. By the time Cleopatra was born, the dynasty was already dying. Egypt was in debt. The army was weak. The people were restless. And Rome was waiting. Cleopatra was the last of this bloodline, and in many ways she was the best of them. She was the only Ptolemaic ruler who bothered to learn Egyptian. She styled herself as a living goddess, the reincarnation of Isis. She connected with her people in a way her ancestors never had. She also understood that Egypt's independence depended on balancing the great powers of the Mediterranean. She allied with Caesar, then Antony, not out of love alone, but out of necessity. She needed Rome's military strength, and she nearly succeeded in turning Egypt into a partner of Rome, rather than a conquered province. But Octavian was too ruthless. Antony was too reckless. And in the end, Cleopatra ran out of options. When she died, the age of the pharaohs died with her. Egypt would not be independent again for over 2,000 years, not until 1952, when Gamal Abdel Nasser overthrew the British-backed monarchy and declared Egypt a republic. Today, tourists visit Alexandria and find almost nothing of Cleopatra's world. The palaces are gone, sunk beneath the Mediterranean after earthquakes and rising sea levels. The Library of Alexandria was destroyed centuries ago, burned and looted multiple times until nothing remained. Even Cleopatra's tomb has never been found. Archaeologists have searched for decades. Some believe her tomb is beneath modern Alexandria, buried under centuries of construction and rubble. Others think it was washed away by the sea when the royal quarters sank into the harbour. In recent years, underwater archaeologists have discovered incredible artifacts in Alexandria's harbour: statues, columns, sphinxes, all remnants of Cleopatra's palace. But the tomb itself remains hidden. Some archaeologists believe Cleopatra and Antony were buried together in a tomb near Alexandria, perhaps near the ancient temple of Osiris Magna. Excavations continue, but so far nothing has been found. It's possible the tomb was looted centuries ago, or destroyed by earthquakes, or lost forever beneath the sea. But wherever Cleopatra is, buried her legacy remains. She was the last pharaoh, the last queen of Egypt, the last of the Ptolemies. She seduced 2 of Rome's most powerful men and nearly changed the course of history. She ruled one of the richest kingdoms in the world and fought to preserve its independence until her very last breath. And when defeat was inevitable, she chose death over surrender. Cleopatra's story has been told and retold for over 2,000 years. Every generation reimagines her. The Romans portrayed her as a dangerous seductress, a witch who corrupted noble Roman men. Medieval Christians saw her as a symbol of sin and lust, a warning about the dangers of female power. Renaissance artists painted her as a tragic heroine, beautiful and doomed. Shakespeare gave her some of the most memorable lines in all of literature. In his play, Antony and Cleopatra, she is complex, passionate, manipulative, and utterly human. In the 20th century, Hollywood made her a movie star. Elizabeth Taylor's portrayal in the 1963 film Cleopatra remains iconic, though the film nearly bankrupted the studio, and Taylor herself almost died during production. But in all these versions, something essential is often lost: Cleopatra's intelligence. She wasn't just beautiful. She was one of the most educated people of her time. She debated philosophy with scholars. She studied mathematics and astronomy. She conducted scientific experiments, testing poisons on condemned prisoners to find the least painful method of suicide. She was a polyglot who could negotiate in multiple languages without translators. She understood economics and managed Egypt's vast wealth. She commanded fleets and armies, and she understood propaganda. Her arrival at Tarsus, the golden barge, the purple sails, the costume of Venus, was pure political theatre designed to overwhelm Antony's senses and establish her as a goddess, not a supplicant. Everything Cleopatra did was calculated. She wasn't a victim of passion. She was a ruler fighting for survival in a world dominated by men and empires. Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar and Antony has been romanticized for centuries, but it's important to understand the power dynamics. When Cleopatra met Caesar, she was a 21-year-old queen who had just been overthrown by her teenage brother. Caesar was a 52-year-old general who controlled the most powerful army in the world. She needed him. Without Roman support, she would have been killed by her brother's advisors or spent the rest of her life in exile. So she seduced him. But it wasn't just physical. She offered him something no one else could: Egypt's wealth, Egypt's grain, and a chance to be the patron of the oldest civilization in the world. Caesar in turn saw an opportunity. Egypt was rich, Cleopatra was intelligent, and could be a useful ally. And unlike the corrupt boy king Ptolemy, she understood the game. Their relationship was transactional, but that doesn't mean it wasn't also genuine. Ancient sources suggest Caesar genuinely admired Cleopatra. He kept her statue in the Temple of Venus even after their affair ended. He may have loved her, or at least respected her. With Antony, the dynamic was different. By the time Cleopatra met Antony, she was an experienced ruler. She had survived Caesar's assassination, navigated Rome's civil wars, and ruled Egypt for over a decade. Antony needed her money. She needed his legions. They formed a partnership, political and romantic. Ancient sources describe them as genuinely in love. They spent winters together in Alexandria, feasting and celebrating. They had 3 children. When Antony was dying, his last thoughts were of her. But love and politics were always intertwined. Cleopatra loved Antony, but she also needed him to protect Egypt. Antony loved Cleopatra, but he also needed her gold to fund his wars. In the end, their love wasn't enough. Octavian was too powerful, Actium was too decisive, and Pharaoh was against them. What if things had gone differently? What if Antony had wanted Actium? What if Cleopatra had convinced Octavian to spare her? If Antony had defeated Octavian, the entire course of history would have changed. Rome might have been ruled by Antony and Cleopatra as co-emperors. The capital might have moved to Alexandria. The Roman Empire might have become a Greco-Egyptian-Roman hybrid civilization. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son with Julius Caesar, might have ruled after them, uniting the bloodlines of Caesar and the Ptolemies. Egypt might have remained independent, a partner of Rome rather than a conquered province. But Octavian won, and he was ruthless enough to ensure no rival could ever challenge him. He killed Caesarion to eliminate any potential claimant to Caesar's legacy. He paraded Cleopatra's children through Rome as captives, though he did spare their lives. He turned Egypt into a personal province of the emperor, so wealthy and important that no senator was allowed to visit without imperial permission. And he rewrote history. Octavian, now Augustus, commissioned poets and historians to portray Antony as a traitor and Cleopatra as a foreign witch. He made himself the hero who saved Rome from an Eastern queen. And for 2,000 years, that version of the story dominated. Only recently have historians begun to reconsider. to look past the Roman propaganda and to see Cleopatra as she really was, a brilliant ruler fighting impossible odds to save her kingdom. Cleopatra's death marked the end of an era, not just for Egypt, but for the entire ancient world. She was the last of the Hellenistic monarchs, the Greek dynasties that had ruled the Mediterranean world since Alexander the Great. After Alexander died, his generals carved up his empire. The Ptolemies took Egypt, the Seleucids took Syria and Mesopotamia, the Antigonids took Macedonia. For 3 centuries, these kingdoms dominated the ancient world. They were wealthy, cultured, and powerful. They built magnificent cities, patronized art and science and torch, and spread Greek culture across the Mediterranean. But one by one, Rome conquered them all. Macedonia fell in 168 BC, the Seleucid Empire collapsed in 63 BC, and finally in 30 BC, Egypt, the richest and oldest of them all, became a Roman province. The Hellenistic age was over. The Roman age had begun. Cleopatra was the last queen of the Old World. After her, there would be no more independent kingdoms in the Mediterranean, only Rome. For the next 500 years, Rome would dominate the known world, and Egypt, once the greatest kingdom on earth, would be reduced to a province, a breadbasket that fed Rome's armies and citizens. The pharaohs were gone. The pyramids stood silent. And Cleopatra's name became a legend. This is how Cleopatra is remembered, not as a victim, not as a seductress, but as a queen who refused to bow. She was born into a dying dynasty. She inherited a kingdom drowning in debt, threatened by Rome, torn apart by civil wars. She could have surrendered. She could have lived as a Roman puppet, a client queen who took orders from senators and generals. Instead, she fought. She allied with the most powerful men in Rome. She seduced emperors. She commanded armies. She nearly changed history. And when she lost, she chose her own death rather than be paraded through Rome in chains. That is power. That is defiance. That is why we still remember her name 2,000 years later. The Ptolemaic dynasty began with Alexander the Great's generals seizing Egypt in the chaos after Alexander's death. It ended with Cleopatra dying in her palace, dressed as a goddess, a snake at her breast. For 300 years, the Ptolemies ruled Egypt. They built monuments, collected knowledge, and commanded wealth beyond imagination. But they also tore themselves apart. They married their siblings, poisoned their rivals, and destroyed their own bloodline from within. And in the end, they were conquered by Rome, not because they were weak, but because Rome was too strong. Cleopatra understood this. She knew Egypt couldn't defeat Rome. So she tried to seduce it, to ally with it, to survive by becoming indispensable to Rome's greatest leaders. She nearly succeeded. If Antony had defeated Octavian at Actium, history would have been very different. But fate decided otherwise. Cleopatra lost. Egypt became a Roman province, and the age of the pharaohs came to an end. But Cleopatra's story did not end with her death. It lived on in poetry, art, literature, and legend. She became more famous in death than she ever was in life. And 2,000 years later, we still remember her name. Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, the last of the Ptolemies, the woman who defied Rome, seduced emperors, and chose death over defeat. She ruled for 22 years. She died at 39, and she left behind a legend that will never die. This has been Bloodline Chronicles.